The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 9th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen, listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of these things that they had seen. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise you, O Christ.
Please be seated. I'm sure you've heard this question asked on occasion. If you were able to sit down and visit with any figure from the past, any historical figure, who would it be? Now, honestly, as I've thought about that, I really haven't had a burning desire to sit down and visit with anyone from the past. But as I thought about this sermon and I thought about that question, I decided there were a few people that it might be interesting to have a moment to speak with and talk to. And I thought I might start with King Herod. Right? There's a guy in the Bible that hangs over all the big events, especially Jesus' birth. Like, what was with King Herod that he was so obsessed with the prophecies about a little baby boy taking away his throne, taking away his kingship? It might be an interesting conversation. Then as I thought about it, and being Lutheran, I thought, yeah, you know what, I probably should sit down with Martin Luther, right? And understand what happened with the church 500 years ago. He was there at the front end of the church in the midst of the abuses and the controversy. And I would love to ask Martin Luther the question of what he thinks of the state of the Christian church on earth today. It would probably be quite comical when you think about it. Then how about Abraham Lincoln, right? There was one of our first leaders who presided over a nation divided. What insights could Abraham Lincoln give to us today as we seem to be a very fractured and broken nation? Then as I thought about it, and this would be a little bit of a controversial visit, but what would it be like to sit down with Adolf Hitler? Right? We throw around the term that someone's acting like Hitler all the time now. It's heard in politics, but understanding what made him tick and understanding what it was like to be Hitler might help us understand the signs that we think we're seeing in today's world. Or how about, since we just passed the 50th anniversary of his death, how about sitting down with Martin Luther King Jr., right? What would he think of race relations in today's world, and what would he have to say about it? Now, that's a fun exercise of imagination for us, right? But Peter, James, and John on the top of the mountain Transfiguration had the opportunity to do exactly that. As Jesus' divine power as God shined through his human flesh, as he turned white and bright, all of a sudden out of heaven, out of the past, came Moses and Elijah there on the mountaintop. Those privileged apostles who got to witness that moment didn't exactly know what to do. Even Luke tells us that in the scriptures. And so they do the one thing that they think they should do. Peter asks, should I build 3 dwellings? One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Why? Because Peter doesn't want the moment to end. He knows he's witnessing something special, and I'm sure Peter was motivated by the idea of being able to sit down and glean the knowledge and the wisdom and the history that Moses and Elijah could offer to them in that moment that they were there on the mountain. This moment of the Transfiguration is a culmination of God's plan of salvation that we hear about all through the Old Testament. Now, we don't We call the Old Testament today the Old Testament, but it wasn't always called the Old Testament. It used to be called the Law and the Prophets before there was a New Testament with the story of Jesus and all those things that make us Christian today. And the two primary representatives of the Law and the Prophets were Moses and Elijah. Moses was the one to whom God gave the law, the Ten Commandments, as he was leading the people to the promised land of Israel. And Elijah was the first of the many prophets who would give the clues and the insights and the tips to who this long-awaited Savior and Messiah would be. So their appearance out of heaven on this mountain, as Jesus is getting closer and closer to going to Jerusalem and to the events of Holy Week, serve as this public announcement that Jesus is the one, the long-awaited Messiah and Savior, foretold in the Old Testament, in the Law and the Prophets, beginning with Moses and with Elijah. As we heard about in the epistle reading from Paul, this is a moment where, as Jesus' divine power and glory shines through his human flesh, where the veil that covers the face of people is lifted. That idea of the veil, of being blinded, is intertwined throughout our readings today. We hear that when Moses went up on the mountaintop to receive the law, to meet face to face with God, the glory and the power of God's perfection was so great that Moses had to veil his face when he came down from the mountain because it was so bright and shiny. And that became symbolic of what the law would do to mankind. God gave the law as a gift, yes, for people to know right and wrong and what the expectations would be. But at the same time, the law became a burden because no one could keep the law and the expectations of God perfectly. And because of that, there was always that burden of being wrong, of being filled and struggling with sin. So Paul comes along and says that at that moment, when we began to see the power of Jesus that would be unleashed after his resurrection, after he rises from the dead and defeats sin and death, that's the lifting of the veil. No longer would humanity be burdened and blinded by sin and the law that points it out. But now humanity, because of the love and the power of Christ, would be free. And that light of God's love would shine eternally. Now you probably noticed, to your surprise, that Jesus wasn't on my list of historical characters to sit down and meet with when I talked about that at the beginning of the sermon. Well, that's because we already do that. Every time we gather here in God's house around these gifts of word and sacrament, we are sitting with Jesus at Jesus' feet. Every time that we're here, we're having this personal conversation whereby the wisdom, the insight, the history, and the knowledge that our Lord knows is given to us. One of the reasons why Jesus wouldn't allow Peter to build those dwellings on the mountaintop for Moses and Elijah and Jesus was to show that power and that presence of God and those who have gone before us in glory cannot be contained to one limited space. That by the power of Christ's godliness, his divinity, that shines through his humanity, God's power is unleashed and everywhere. So we have the assurance and the blessing that no matter where we go in the world, when we gather around these gifts of word and sacrament, God's presence is with us. We are meeting face to face with our Savior, and we are seeing and receiving the fullness of his glory that brightens our lives and brightens our faces. Transfiguration Sunday every single year brings us to a close at the end of the Epiphany season. It began with the star that led those wise men to the light of the world, Jesus, and then those wise men went back to their home country and shined the light of Jesus. They told others the joy. Now today that season ends as we're reminded that that baby boy was both God and man, as God's power shined through the flesh of Jesus on top of the mountain. And even though the season of light comes to a close today, that does not mean that we stop shining the light of God's love. Every time we end our time here in God's house, we hear that blessing that Aaron gave to the people of Israel after Moses delivered the people to the promised land. The Lord's face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. Every time we're here, God's face shines upon us. And like Peter, James, and John did after the resurrection, we shine God's light and love on others.